Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, Chapter 22, Section 3. Yesterday, Chapter 22, Section 2. We meet Florence Nightingale yesterday. This is the British Army nurse that says, the very first requirement of a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. We also met, and this is the title of the video, really the makings of a conspiracy, really. The textbook was wrong. The textbook introduced us to, and I'm missing his name, but if you're interested in what I'm talking about, rambling-wise, you can check out yesterday's video and the description below the video where I have a source to invalidate this textbook. I appreciate everything that this textbook has offered, but I did actually notice something, and I invalidated it in the video yesterday, in the description. Please check it out if you're interested. John Michael, Context is Everything Media Network. Please subscribe and like if you're interested and you like my candor. If not, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Okay, Chapter 22, Section 3, page 555 of 1007. Changing attitudes and values. Setting the scene. Only a woman has accepted an offer of marriage. All she has. Once a woman has accepted the offer of a marriage, all she has become virtually the property of a man she has accepted as a husband. This advice appeared in a 1859 British publication called The Whatnot, or Ladies' Handbook. But not all women accepted such restrictions. One Italian crusader for women's rights denounced the inferior legal status of women. I only know how to do British accents. This is an Italian woman. For her, taxes, but not an education. For her, sacrifices, but not employment. Strong enough to be laden with an array of painful duties, but sufficiently weak not to be allowed to govern herself. Again in Italian, Anna Mazzoni. La libertazione della donna. Demand for women's rights was one of many issues that challenged traditional social order in the late 1800s. By then, the social order itself was changing. In many countries, the middle class increasingly came to dominate society. Anew. Social order. Heading. A new social order. The Industrial Revolution slowly changed the old social order in the Western world. For centuries, the two main classes were nobles and peasants. Their roles were defined by their relationship in the land. While middle-class merchants, artisans, lawyers, and officials played important roles, they still occupied a secondary position in society. With the spread of industry, a more complex social structure emerged. By the late 1800s, Western Europe's new upper class included super-rich industrial and business families, as well as old nobility. Wealthy entrepreneurs married into aristocratic families, gaining the status and noble titles. Nobles needed the money brought by industrial rich to support their lands and lifestyle. By tradition, the upper class held the top jobs in government and the military. Below this tiny elite, a growing middle class was pushing its way up the social ladder. Its highest rung were filled by the medieval business people and professionals such as doctors, scientists, and lawyers. With comfortable incomes, they enjoyed a wide range of material goods. Next came the lower middle class, which included teachers, office workers, shopkeepers, and clerks. Even though they earned much smaller incomes, they struggled to keep up with their betters. At the base of the social ladder were workers and peasants. In highly industrialized Britain, workers made up more than 30% of the population in 1900. In Western Europe and the United States, the number of farm workers dropped, but many families still worked the land. The rural population was even higher in Eastern and Southern Europe, where industrialization was limited. Middle class values. By mid-century, mid-18th, mid-19th century, mid-19th century, by mid-century, the modern middle class had developed its own way of life. These are middle class values. The nuclear family lived in large house, or perhaps in one of the new apartment houses. Rooms were crammed with large, overstuffed furniture, and paintings and photographs lined the walls. Clothing reflected middle-class taste and luxury and respectability. A strict code of etiquette governed the social behaviors. Rules dictated how to dress for every occasion, how to give a dinner party, how to pay a social call, when to write letters, and how long to mourn for relatives who died. Parents strictly supervised their children, who were expected to be seen but not heard. A child who misbehaved was considered to reflect badly on the entire family. Servants, too, were seen as a reflection of their employers. Even a small middle-class household was expected to have at least a cook and a housemaid. Sipping tea in a Victorian parlor. That's a picture of folks sipping tea in a Victorian parlor. You see the young lady playing the piano. You see a little bit older lady receiving a piece of paper on a plate. And you see a gentleman with glasses on handing her a plate with a piece of paper on it. Okay. Excellent. Courtship and marriage. As in the past, middle-class families had a large say in choosing whom their children married. At the same time, young people had more freedom to choose a marriage partner. The notion of falling in love was more accepted than ever before. Yet most women and men carefully considered the practical side of marriage. Mothers and daughters discussed the likely prospect of possible husband. A young man was expected to court his bride-to-be with tender sentiments, but he also had to convince her father that he could support her in style. Until the late 1800s, in most Western countries, a husband controlled his wife's property, so marriage contracts were drawn up to protect a daughter's property rights. So we're talking about middle-class families in the middle 1800s, the mid-century, the mid-19th century. The ideal home. Within the family circle, the division of labor between wife and husband changed. In earlier times, middle-class women had often helped run family businesses out of the home. By the later 1800s, most middle-class husbands went to work in an office or shop. A successful husband spent their working hours raising children. What? A successful husband was one whose income was enough to keep his wife at home. Women spent their working hours raising children, directing the servants, and perhaps doing religious or charitable services. Books, magazines, and popular songs supported a cult of domesticity that idealized women and the home. Sayings like, "Home sweet home," were stitched into needlework and hung on parlor walls. The ideal woman was seen as a tender, self-sacrificing caregiver who provided a nest for her children and a peaceful refuge for her husband. Live, laugh, love. This ideal rarely applied to the lower classes. Working class women labored for low pay in garment factories or worked as domestic servants. Young women might leave domestic service after they married, but often had to seek other employment. Despite long days working for wages, they were still expected to take full responsibility for children, for childcare and homemaking. Rights of women. New heading. Some individual women and women's groups protested restrictions on women. Like earlier pioneers, Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft. They sought a broad range of rights. Across Europe and the United States, politically active women campaigned for fairness in marriage, divorce, and property laws. Women's groups also supported the temperance movement, a campaign to limit or ban the use of alcoholic beverages. Temperance leaders argued that drinking threatened family life. These reformers faced many obstacles. In Europe and the United States, women could not vote. They were barred from most schools and had little, if any, protection under the law. A woman's husband or father controlled her property. Early voices. Before 1850, some women had become leaders in union movements. Others, mostly from the middle class, had campaigned for the abolition of slavery. In the process, they realized the severe restrictions on their own lives. In the United States, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony crusaded against slavery before organizing a movement for women's rights. Many women broke the barriers that kept them out of universities and professions. By the late 1800s, a few brave women overcame opposition to train as doctors or lawyers. Others became explorers, researchers, or inventors, often without recognition. For example, Julia Brainard, Brainerd. Julia Brainard Hall worked with her brother to develop an aluminum producing process. Their company became hugely successful, but Charles Hall received almost all of the credit. The suffrage struggle. By the late 1800s, married women in some countries had won the right to control their own property. The struggle for political rights proved far more difficult. In the United States, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 demanded that women be granted the right to vote. In Europe, groups dedicated to women's suffrage, or women's right to vote, emerged in the later 1800s. Among men, some liberals and socialists supported women's suffrage. In general, though, suffragists faced intense opposition. Some critics claimed that women were too emotional to be allowed to vote. Others argued that women needed to be protected from the grubby politics, or that a woman's place is at home, not in government. To such claims, Sojourner Truth, an African-American suffragist, is believed to have replied, "Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles, or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman?" Shouldn't have done a British accent. On the edges of the Western world, women made faster strides. In New Zealand, Australia, and some Western territories of the United States, women won the vote before 1900. There, women who had tamed the frontier alongside men were not dismissed as weak and helpless. In Europe, only after World War I, you will read more about that and the suffrage movement in later chapters. Growth of public education. New heading. Growth of public education. By the late 1800s, reformers persuaded many governments to set up a public school and require basic education for all children, teaching the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, was thought to produce better citizens. In addition, industrialized societies recognized the need for a literate workforce. Schools taught punctuality, obedience to authority, disciplined work habits, and patriotism. In European schools, children also received basic religious education. Public education. At first, elementary schools were primitive. Many teachers had little schooling themselves. In rural areas, students attended class only during the times when they were not needed on the farm or in their parents' shops. By the late 1800s, more and more children were in school, and the quality of elementary education improved. Also, governments began to expand secondary schools, known as high schools in the United States. In secondary schools, students learned the classical languages, Latin and Greek, along with history and mathematics. In general, only middle-class families could afford to have their sons attend these schools, which trained students for more serious study or for government jobs. Middle-class girls were sent to school primarily in the hope that they might marry well and become better wives and mothers. Higher education. Colleges and universities expanded in this period too. Most university students were the sons of middle or upper class families. In the university curriculum emphasized ancient history and languages, philosophy, religion, and the law. By the late 1800s, universities added courses in the sciences, especially in chemistry and physics. At the same time, engineering school trained students who would have the knowledge and skills to build new industrial society. Some women sought greater educational opportunities. By the 1840s, a few small colleges for women opened, including Bedford College in England and Mount Holyoke in the United States. In 1863, the British reformer Emily Davies campaigned for female students to be allowed to take entrance examinations at Cambridge University. She succeeded. But as late as 1897, male Cambridge students rioted against granting degrees to women. The new direction of science. New directions in science. As you have seen, science in the service of industry brought great changes in the later 1800s. At the same time, researchers advanced startling theories about the natural world. Their new ideas challenged long-held beliefs. Atomic theory. A critical breakthrough in chemistry came in the early 1800s when an English Quaker schoolteacher, John Dalton, developed modern atomic theory. The ancient Greeks had speculated that all matter was made up of tiny particles called atoms. Dalton showed how different kinds of atoms combined to make all chemical substances. In 1869, the Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev drew up a table that grouped elements according to their atomic weight. Mendeleev's table became the basis of the periodic table of elements used today. The age of the Earth. New science of geology opened disturbing avenues of debate. In Principles of Geology, 1830 to 1833, Charles Lyell offered evidence to show that the Earth had formed over millions of years. His successors concluded that the Earth was at least 2 billion years old and that life had not appeared until long after the Earth was formed. These ideas did not seem to agree with the biblical accounts of creation. Archaeology added other pieces to an emerging debate about the origins of life on Earth. In 1856, workers in the NEANDER Valley of Germany. In 1856, workers in the NEANDER Valley of Germany accidentally uncovered fossilized bones of prehistoric people, whom scientists called Neanderthals. There's a place called Neander? That's what Neanderthals are named after? How strange. Neander. Bizarre. Neander, Germany. Really? A Neanderthal. A guy from Neander. Or a woman. Guy or gal. Neander. How strange. How strange. Truly odd. Truly odd. Later scholars found fossils of other prehistoric humans and animals. These pioneering archaeologists had limited evidence and often drew mistaken conclusions, as they do today. But as more discoveries were made around the world, scholars developed new ideas about early human life. The Darwin Challenge. New heading. The most disturbing new idea came from the British naturalist Charles Darwin. In 1859, after years of research, he published On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species. Darwin argued that all forms of life had evolved into their present state over millions of years. To explain the long, slow process of evolution, he put forward his theory of natural selection. Darwin adopted Thomas Malthus's idea that all plants and animals produced more offspring than the food supply could support. As a result, he said, members of each species constantly competed to survive. Natural forces selected those who, with physical traits, best adapted to their environment. For example, short-necked giraffes, unable to reach leaves at the top of trees, would starve. Long-necked giraffes, however, would survive and pass that trait onto their offspring. This process of natural selection came to be known as survival of the fittest. Over time, survival of the fittest. That doesn't apply anymore. Okay. I'm joking. But our society kind of ignores it. And I ignore it too. Over time, said Darwin, natural selection would give rise to eternally new species. He applied his theory to humans. Man, he declared, is descended from some less highly organized form. He claimed that humans, like all life forms, were still evolving. Wisdom teeth. Some people don't get wisdom teeth. The Darwin Furor, F-U-R-O-R. Never heard of that word before in my life. The Darwin Furor. Like the ideas of Nicolaus Copernicus and Galileo Galilei. In earlier times, Darwin's theories ignited a furious debate between scientists and theologians. To many Christians, the Bible contained only the true account of creation. It told how God created the world and all forms in 6 days. Darwin's theory, they argued, reduced people to a level of animals and undermined belief of God in the soul. What a freaking... I mean, this is 2001. This is when we were indoctrinating the youth into just being atheist. But this is such a terrible argument because you're putting words in the mouth of what the actual writing of the Bible meant, and you're assuming that it was meant to be very scientifically specific and scientifically accurate. You're separating people from wisdom. You're making them not believe wisdom because the science doesn't line up. But it's not a book about science. It's a book about wisdom. And so it's a clever ruse to convince people in 2001 when this book was copywritten and today that, the attempt is still going on today, but I think that it's going to be quashed by common sense, hopefully, as time will tell. Wisdom is the value of the ancient texts that have survived. Science, probably not why they were written, Unbelievably stupid. Really unbelievably stupid argument. And I will debate anybody on it because it's not really a scientific debate. It's common sense debate. Well, some Christians eventually came to accept the idea of evolution. Others did not. Controversy over Darwin's theory has continued to the present day, especially in the United States. Yeah, right. That is manufactured controversy. Manufactured controversy by centralized media outlets, which are very much dying at this point in 2023. Very good thing that they are dying, because they're bad. Social Darwinism. I agree with this guy. I think he's right. Darwin's right, I think. Darwin himself never promoted any social ideas. However, some thinkers used Darwin's theories to support their own beliefs about society. Their ideas became known as social Darwinism, applying the idea of survival of the fittest to war and economic competition. Industrial tycoons argued that social Darwinists were more fit than those they put out of business. That's capitalism, right? War brought progress by weeding out weak nations. Victory was seen as proof of supremacy, right? Social Darwinism encouraged racism, the belief that one racial group is superior to another. By the late 1800s, many Europeans and Americans claimed that the success of the Western civilization was due to the supremacy of the white race. Karl Pearson, a British mathematician, wrote, "History shows me one way, and one way only, in which a high state of civilization can be produced, namely the struggle of race with race, and the survival of the physically and mentally fitter race." By the end of the century, as you will read, such ideas would be used to justify global expansionism and imperialism, as well as racial discrimination and segregation. New heading. And final heading. Thank you for joining me. If you agree with my ramblings, please subscribe. Please like. If you've made it this far, please subscribe and like. If you're not going to subscribe and like, that's okay. I appreciate your time and your attention. Or if this is in the background, I appreciate you having this on ambiently in the background, hence the name, Ambient Classroom. Religion in the urban age. Despite the challenge of our new ideas, religion continued to be a major force in Western society. Christian churches and Jewish synagogues remained at the center of communities. Religious leaders influenced political, social, and educational developments. The grim realities of industrial life stimulated feelings of compassion and charity. In Europe, Christian labor unions and political parties pushed for reform. Individuals and church groups tried to help the working poor. Catholic priests and nuns set up schools and hospitals in urban slums. In the United States, Jewish organizations such as B'nai B'rith, B''Nai, B'Rifth, provided similar social services. In Europe and the United States, many Protestant churches backed the social gospel, a movement that urged Christians into social service. They campaigned for reforms in housing, healthcare, and education. By the 1878, William and Catherine Booth had set up a Salvation Army in London. It both spread Christian teachings and provided social services. I think that it's kind of funny that they give you the religious people are stubbornly wrong about Darwinism, followed by the religious people do a lot of nice things. So that in the classroom, the 6 people that followed religion in 2001 when this book was published, and the 22 people that were self-proclaimed atheists at the age of 14, so that they could have conflict. That was the point, and there's really no doubt in my mind. Have a good day. God bless. Goodbye.